A quick word before this episode begins. Fictitious has been on an unplanned hiatus since May. After the death of George Floyd and the subsequent protests, promoting a podcast felt frivolous, like noise in the signal when there were more important things to talk about, especially in social media spaces. So I decided to hold on new episodes for a while. Soon after, the sci-fi and fantasy publishing community erupted with some difficult but necessary conversations about the conduct of professional peers. And then suddenly it was summer, when I usually end the current season of Fictitious as my family pilgrimages to San Diego Comic-Con, which obviously didn't happen this year, though we participated in the digital event. And now we're in mid-August in a world just as fraught and tumultuous, where the struggle for equality and safety and respect goes on. But life and work goes on too, as everyone fights to make ends meet in a turbulent economy. And authors are still writing books, still creating worlds to help us escape, to help us feel, to help us contextualize reality through vivid prisms of fiction and imagination. So Fictitious returns, and I share with you interviews you should have heard months ago. This one, with Martha Wells, was recorded back in May, before new and flagrant injustices demanded response and summoned resistance. I've found comfort in Martha's books during the pandemic, and I hope hearing this and the following interviews gives you comfort and helps you with your writing in these trying times. Hey readers and writers, I'm Adrian Buskey, and you're listening to Fictitious, a podcast about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. In this episode, I'm excited to welcome Martha Wells, author of the MurderBot Diaries. This award-winning science fiction series features the introverted, cynical, and frequently hilarious security robot that thinks privately of itself as MurderBot. It's mostly machine, partially organic construct, corporate-owned, and rented out to space-exploring organizations. There are plenty of sec units just like it, except MurderBot hacked its systems to allow greater autonomy, which mostly consists of slacking on the job and downloading as much serial entertainment as it can stream. When its latest clients, a scientific research team exploring a distant planet, find themselves in danger after a neighboring mission goes dark, MurderBot must exploit all of its unique talents and perspectives to defend them, which risks revealing to its human crew that it's broken free of its corporate limitations, as well as an unpleasant history that inspired its threatening moniker. The MurderBot Diaries includes 4 novellas, All Systems Red, Artificial Condition, Rogue Protocol, and Exit Strategy, and a brand new full-length novel called Network Effect, which is available now from Tor.com Books. And Martha, welcome to Fictitious.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I am super excited to get you on here because I am 2 novellas deep into this series now, and I've already been texting my friends saying, this is your thing, you need to go buy these right now, these are great. In the age of COVID, I have sometimes struggled to actually stay connected to books, or at least to have that sense of propulsion of like, can't put it down. And this is the first ones where I'm like, I'm reading them on my iPad, and which is I'm not a big digital reader, it's not how I usually consume books, yet I cannot let go of it. I have so thoroughly enjoyed MurderBot and this world that you've created and this character. So I'm super stoked to have you on here. I will note that since this is a 5-book series so far, we'll talk story-wise, try to be non-spoilery, kind of focusing on the first one with All Systems Red, and then, kind of a more generalized idea of how we go across it, because I don't want to spoil anything for anybody. But how well did I sum that up? Because I didn't get too deep into MurderBot, but I wanted to let you talk about them.
Yeah, I think you summed it up pretty well, especially if we're going to stick with the first two novellas.
Well, one of the things that I think is great is, and I say this a lot on the show, one of the sexiest phrases in the book language is novella to me. I am not a big doorstopper reader. I'm not the kind of person these days who wants a 700-page novel. And so when something comes across my bow that is like 150 pages, I am so excited. That is right in my avenue. So the first 4 of these being shorter pieces that are very much connected, very much a part of a whole, but are lean and move quickly is super awesome. Where did this initial concept come from? Because you have a huge body of work. So you've got a lot of stuff in fantasy and YA and other things. What brought you to doing a novella, and what inspired MurderBot?
Originally, it was an idea for a short story. I thought it was going to be a short story with a sad ending. And I'm not sure where the idea came from. I wrote it in 2016. I was very angry about I've been angry probably a lot of my life, but I was very angry about the political situation and I needed somewhere to somehow to deal with that. And I was finishing up my last fantasy novel, The Harbors of the Sun, and was just getting a lot of ideas. It'd been kind of a difficult book to write. It'd been a lot of work. And so I was just, I guess, desperately trying to think of other things besides the book. And I just came up with a bunch of different ideas, and that was one of them. This idea for an enslaved security person who had this governor module, but they'd hacked it. And they would have to reveal that in order to save the people that they were guarding. And yeah, it was going to have a sad ending. MurderBot was going to die at the end. And then when I was able to start working on it after I finished the book, the first draft of the book, the character really just kind of came alive for me. The first scene I did was the first scene I'd gotten the idea for was when Dr. Menson knocks on the cubicle wall, which is very kind of a transgressive act, and it really sets off the whole relationship between them. I wrote that scene first, then I got the first line of the story and figured out the first scene, and then just went straight through. And yeah, the first one was very quick to write. I'm not a super fast writer. If I do 1,000 words a day, it's pretty good for me. This one I just did straight through. It took me about a month. All the others have been much longer and much harder, with a lot of rewriting and cutting things out and false starts and all that. But All Systems Red went pretty fast.
One of the things, and I mentioned this in the intro, but is an interesting point about MurderBot as a character, and I see people highlight it a lot, is that it mostly wants to be left alone, and it mostly just wants to spend all of its time just soaking up entertainment. A reoccurring element that's mentioned in the story is its like favorite series, which is called The Rise and Fall of Sanctuary Moon, and gets referenced fairly frequently in it. There's another show it likes called World Hoppers. You know, it's really into serial entertainment and watching these shows and watching human drama, even though it finds a fair amount of disdain for the humans that are generally in its company. How is that something that kind of developed out with this character and just the personality of MurderBot?
Well, I didn't want to write a story about a robot that wanted to become human, just because that's a very common story. I wanted to write more about a robot that did not want to be human, and I wanted to try to think about what an artificial intelligence would actually want, as opposed to what humans think an artificial intelligence would want, particularly in MurderBot's situation, where everyone assumes a free sec unit would immediately run away and start shooting all the humans it could, and that it didn't want to kill anybody. It just wanted to be left alone. Again, it's like it's been so long, and I'm not sure if these were, I don't really have like single things that spark ideas. Usually they just come from a lot of different places. Watching TV, especially when I was a kid, was really important for me, just as comfort, as company, keeping me from being lonely, all this other kind of thing. And so I thought I wanted to kind of get that across for MurderBot. I wanted it to basically look out and see what was available when it got rid of its governor module or hacked its governor module. I wanted it to look out and see what was available out in basically this far future version of the internet, and see all this stuff and realize all this stuff is pretty good, pretty cool. If I go out and kill people, I'm not going to be able to partake of this. So it's just kind of, in some ways, it's that simple. Also, once it started getting into those, especially the Rise and Fall of Sanctuary Moon, it talks about this later in one of the novellas, but that's the one that really helped contextualize its emotions. So these serials really helped it kind of come to some kind of understanding of itself and what it was feeling, and gave it something else to see the world as, besides just the servitude of being trapped as a sec unit.
There's a scene in the second novella that's essentially a conversation between MurderBot and this other construct called a ComfortBot, and also sort of on the sideline, Art, who's this other artificial intelligence that is part of a ship. And I don't want to go too much into Art, but I love Art. I love Art so much, and I love Art and MurderBot together. But there's a moment where the ComfortBot says, its real wish would be, well, why don't we just kill all the humans? And immediately Art and MurderBot have the conversation. Like, Art's like, why would it want to do that? And MurderBot's like, yeah, who would make all the entertainment?
Yeah, it's a human thing to think that, well, if in this situation a human would want to kill all the other humans. That's not necessarily what an AI would want. particularly Art, who hasn't had bad experiences at all, really. So, since it's an extremely powerful armed spaceship, yeah.
Yeah, just that interchange was so entertaining. But I guess we should probably contextualize a little bit more of this world as well, because when we talk about MurderBot, we say it's a security unit. This is, essentially a robot that has organic tissue, is cloned from a human being, but built around machine parts, and is essentially a slave for a corporation that uses a lot of these things to ensure safety on all of these different other space excursions. Can you kind of tell us more about this science fiction setting? I mean, it's spacefaring, and we are seeing it entirely through the eyes of MurderBot and contextualized through its mind. But what can you kind of explain about this particular version of the universe?
They're in the corporation rim, which is basically in the world is a giant section of all these different large corporations that control basically sections of space. They control solar systems. They control asteroids and planets and moons and all these different ways and combinations. There are small corporations, big ones. A lot of the space stations that MurderBot travels to and from are basically controlled by small individual companies. But then there's giant corporations that have a lot bigger territory, and there's no real government that's not part of these corporations, and they have legal codes between them that they've agreed on, so they won't immediately go out and kill each other and destroy each other for their territory. But that's basically the only thing that's holding it together. It's very dystopian. Individual people don't have a lot of protections other than trying to accumulate money, so they don't have to be beholden to a corporation. MurderBot encounters, especially later in the series, a lot of people who have had to sell themselves basically into corporate indenture, which is just basically slavery, and they've signed contracts because they've had to, that they don't necessarily understand what they're doing, how long they'll be trapped in these contracts, which might be for the rest of their lives. So basically MurderBot, the sec units being enslaved, is just kind of one tier of the injustice in the society. Outside the corporation rim, there's all these other kind of individual political areas that are more like what we would understand a political area, governments, that are controlling former colonies and in different places and places that don't have any government. There's a lot of variety basically outside the corporation rim. But MurderBot right now is basically stuck in the corporation rim around all these corporations, which have a lot of control over basically every aspect of life under their territory.
One of the fun things in this series is that because this is a first-person narration from MurderBot, which is something I want to delve into more too, because this is a very different kind of perspective to explore with a character, because there's a lot of things that are familiar and a lot of things that are also kind of alien. But MurderBot knows quite a lot because of its access to news and stream feeds. But MurderBot also has some limitations in its own interests, in that it has a great deal of apathy for things that don't directly affect it. It starts off as just a general, I don't care about that, so I don't learn about it. And over time becomes a impulse that it's starting to learn to suppress, that sort of apathetic reaction. Exploring this world and delving out pieces bit by bit, I mean, that's always part of the challenge of world building in any kind of novel. But in this one, you have a character whose perspective is particularly interesting because of that level of interest and because it's not human. What were you thinking about as you were sort of world building off of that and using MurderBot's POV to give us bits and pieces of it at a time?
Well, when I write, I usually like to stick very closely to the POV of the main characters, or just if I only usually use a few viewpoint characters. I like to stick really close to that POV because I want the reader to explore the world through the point of view of the character and not necessarily get a lot of information about what else is out there that the character hasn't encountered yet, and to kind of focus on the story, the plot as we go along. So it's kind of normal way of writing for me. MurderBot's situation, where it's been basically trapped and controlled in what it can think about and what it can do, and it's been so confined, it's just taking it a while to extend its focus beyond survival and beyond just kind of the things that it has access to, the media and everything that it feels comforting or is comforted by. It just takes it a while to kind of expand that focus. It doesn't know things about how the wormholes work and a lot of these other things about the world outside the places it's been stuck, where usually like the mining installations or just the technical ready room kind of places where they put the sec units when they're not using them. And it just takes it a while to kind of expand its focus past that and to really think about these things and see the wider world. Particularly in the first two novellas, it's really focused on especially in the second one, it's really just focused on its survival and trying to do what it wants to do and then get out of there. That's why I kind of use that indifference to this kind of stuff, because I thought it would be kind of natural for the character to develop that.
I really like, and you kind of touched on this earlier, that when MurderBot hacks its governor module and essentially gains a certain level of at least intellectual freedom, it doesn't just immediately go, okay, now I'm going to escape and try to go rogue. It doesn't do that at all. It continues to do its job. It continues to operate as a normal sec unit would, and it tries as much as possible to not interact with the humans that it's deployed with, which it isn't even really bothered to learn much about outside of what it just has to in order to know how to protect them, because it just doesn't have much interest in them and it doesn't feel like creating any kind of level of connection. In fact, it's very, very uncomfortable with connection. I liked that about it because it felt like a very different narrative in general. Like you said earlier, this isn't Pinocchio trying to become a real boy. This is a machine intelligence that thinks of itself as a machine intelligence and is not in any way trying to achieve personhood. What it does out of survival and out of a growing protection of these other characters. And I really dig that about it. In the first novel, we meet, like you mentioned earlier, Dr. Mensah and the rest of this particular research squad. In being this as a novella, it's a shorter novel, and it is so focused on MurderBot and MurderBot's own necessary actions and thoughts in the situation. We get those characters, but we don't spend a tremendous amount of time learning about the supporting cast or the antagonists in the story either. And I think novella works well for that. But what were you thinking about as far as putting the story together and knowing you were going to have a certain level of distance from these other characters, maybe more so than what you'd see in your average novel?
Well, to go back a little bit, one of the reasons MurderBot basically stays in its job is change is terrifying. And also I was trying to dig into the idea of you've been controlled all your conscious life, strictly controlled, and somehow suddenly now you have free will. It's kind of a lot to move into that, to immediately start making plans. And that's why really it hasn't really been doing much until, with Dr. Mensah and the others, it has to tell them about the governor module, that the governor module is hacked. Through them, it kind of gets this opportunity to really kind of springboard into and make itself actually go out into the wider world. But the characterization, I wanted to stick with MurderBot's POV, but show a little bit more about the characters. But it sees everything they do in the facility, though it doesn't usually like that. It doesn't like to interact with the humans. And through All Systems Red, as they start to want to interact with it does sort of reveal this information that it's kind of picked up about them, the way their relationships, it knows more about their relationships with each other than the character who didn't quite have that omniscient POV through the security cameras. And it knows when they're upset and when they're angry. And when it reveals this omniscient POV and it talks about what they're doing, I think that's part of the characterization. You're not seeing things from their own point of view, but you're seeing MurderBot's kind of really all-encompassing view of them. And so that's kind of the angle I wanted to take on the characterization.
There's a neat thing about MurderBot's perceptive abilities, which is that as a machine and one that's plugged into a security system, a hub system, all of these different sort of like online, it's what do they call it? Like the Internet of Things, essentially,
Yeah.
This is a future where everything's connected. And there are a lot of different small AIs up to bots that are effectively, very much have their own personality, even if they don't have a traditional body in the way we think of, which is kind of like art that we meet in the second novel. And something I think about a lot when I read books is I think about the sort of adaptability of them. Like, what does this bring as a novel that you could or couldn't do in another space? And here, part of that is what's unique to this is seeing how MurderBot can be in a room talking to somebody, but it will have hacked the security cameras around the room. So it's seeing things from different angles, including its own face, because it does have a human face, which is something it feels kind of weird about. But so it can kind of monitor its own reactions because it doesn't necessarily always have complete impulse control over the expressions it makes. And having that sense of like it's reading stream information from various other content sources and seeing from different angles while experiencing it through a more human-like vantage point. That is a collection of perspectives that I don't think you can get any other way. And it feels very, very fresh and very specific to this character. But like, how much trouble is that to kind of track and be thinking about all the time?
Oh, it's a lot of trouble. I think I really didn't know how much effort I would have to put into this to writing these stories when I came up with this idea. But trying to really give the sense of a real AI that is thinking faster than the humans think and is also drawing in information from all these different sources constantly. It especially makes the fight scenes difficult. And it's one reason why it does take me so long to write the novellas now, or it usually takes about 3 to 4 months for one, 35,000, 33,000 word novella. And for the novel, it took 18 months, which is very different for me. I usually take maybe 11, 12 months at most to write a novel. Most of the books I write, the Raxura series especially, is around 130,000 words, 135, something like that. And this book is 110,000 words. And it took a full 18 months. And a lot of that's writing and thinking about what all these different systems that it would have access to and putting that in and rewriting and realize I've gone wrong in the plot and taking all that out and starting again. So usually it's like I write, 10 to 20,000 words and then usually cut it back to 5,000 and start over and over and over again. So it's very difficult, and you really have to sit and think, because you want the character to be operating the way you've set it out and not just sort of come up with excuses for why it suddenly can't get information from these different sources. So I have to put all that in. It's just a lot of work and a lot of thought, but it gives you so many opportunities for cool things. And I think that's probably one of my favorite things about writing like this is all the kind of compressed action where MurderBot's having a physical fight at one point, but then it's setting up all these different things in different places at the same time. And I can tell what the other characters are doing because MurderBot can see them through a security camera. It's hard work, but it's actually, I think it's really rewarding, and I think it's fun for me, and I think it's fun for the readers.
There's a sequence in the second novel. I don't want to call it like a chase sequence per se, but there's a bit of a pursuit. And there was elements where I felt like, MurderBot is almost reminding me of like sort of Jason Bourne in this situation, where it's like having to assess multiple levels of danger and threat that a normal person would not perceive. And in MurderBot's case, having the stretched perception of being able to touch security networks, being able to look at cameras, being able to think about, what do I need to blank out? What do I need to erase from a memory or replace with, something that makes it look like we haven't been here, while trying to think 4 steps ahead of everything that's going on. And I found that to be really, really fun, and also like that nice mental stretch of trying to keep up with like, what are all these things you would have to think about in a situation where technology is advanced enough that there are just multiple layers more than you need to think about.
Yeah.
When I bring up like the Bourne Identity, I think about reading the original novel, which was, I believe, written in the 70s, versus seeing the original, the first film, which was made in the 2000s, and just the leap between the two as far as cell phones alone changed so much and have vexed so many writers over the last 20 years, I think, as far as situations that don't make sense anymore, where if you have a working cell phone, you just don't have the problems that narratives had in times past. And you made that 1,000 times harder on yourself with the way this world works.
I really did.
Something that I'm always interested in both science fiction and fantasy is when you're creating one of these worlds that both has a lot of layers of things that are fresh to it, and particularly MurderBot as both a character and all these, the stream, the sort of net around people and how they're communicating with it, even humans that are augmented to a certain extent and are sort of tapping a stream all the time as well. You're also playing off of science fiction concepts that people are familiar with to some level. Where do you choose to lean back on something where you're like, well, people know what spaceships are. They understand this certain level of tech. We don't have to go too far into the suits or the armor that people are wearing, because that people who are fans of science fiction and fantasy have some layer of it kind of pre-installed, right? Like there's a base layer that you can kind of build off of. But how do you pick and choose those things? Where do you know that like, okay, I don't want to get too far into this. I don't need to explain the spaceship to them. They know what a spaceship is. Stuff like that. How do you make those choices?
What I really do is I do rely on a certain baseline level. We know what spaceships are and we know what powered armor is, and so we don't really have to explain how that works. But what that kind of lets me do is be very particular about what the special features of it would be that MurderBot could make use of, and to really get into that kind of technical stuff that the reader isn't going, the stuff that I'm making up that the reader is going to semi-recognize, because it's kind of part of this whole super science stuff, and really think about how MurderBot would be able to interact with it and what they would be able to do with it, and what the pros and the cons of it, the defenses that it would have against MurderBot's hacking and MurderBot and the vulnerabilities. And so I can kind of really look at all those things, and then kind of add things like, this comes up in a later novella, but they're in a terraforming station that's orbiting a planet, and thinking about the kind of bots it would use and how it would have like bots for going in and doing mining and bringing up minerals to work on, and all that kind of world building based on that kind of foundation. I think it lets you do a lot more different things. So you don't have to justify, the existence of spaceships or orbiting stations or anything. You just go from there. And so mostly I think about what MurderBot would be interacting with, and what cool features it would have, and all that. And I kind of think with that, it's kind of like with a fantasy novel, where you see a lot of the really older stuff, like the Worm Ouroboros and those older books, where they would have to justify how the narrator knew these events were going on this strange, mysterious world. And they would have to explain, there's a strange manuscript that was found in a trunk, and that's how I know these things happened. And now, of course, we don't have to, with a fantasy novel, we don't have to do that. We just start straight from, this is a secondary world. It's a magical world. I don't have to explain, any of those things, and just start from there. And science fiction is the same way. We don't have to explain, there are starships, and it's a ship that goes in space, and we don't have to come up with that stuff. So I kind of think of it in the same way a lot. It's similar in that respect to fantasy novels.
You mentioned earlier that in drafting these, the first one was easy. The later ones were much harder. That tracks with pretty much how everybody seems to talk about sequels, where it seems like you would think they'd get easier as they go, and it doesn't seem to happen.
Do not, because you're expanding the world and you're continuing the character arcs. It's easier to set things up, and sometimes it's easier to end them, but it's that middle part that occupy like the most of a series, where you're having to, deepen the character conflict and deepen the character relationships, and really having to get into that and make it more meaningful and more interesting for the reader. And you're having to expand the world building and really think about how the cool stuff you came up with, for your little short piece, and how that's going to play into the larger world. And that's the fun part, really, is really trying to deepen your world and really expanding it. But it's also the most difficult part.
Yeah, the more aspects and corners you introduce, the more places you can also get stuck.
Yeah, the more opportunities to realize that 100 pages back you painted yourself into a corner, and now you have to dig a tunnel to get out or something.
So what is your drafting process like? Are you an outliner or discovery writer? Because you've mentioned that you will sometimes scrap huge chunks of what you've written and go back to sort of the kernel of what worked.
I'm not very much of an outliner. I'm a discovery writer, I think, because a lot of the best stuff I've come up with is things that just kind of occurred to me while I was writing. And I have had to outline in the past. I did a Star Wars novel and 2 Stargate Atlantis novels that needed outlines for the licensing, the publisher that was licensing them. What I've realized is that I can't tell if a fight scene or an action sequence is going to work until I'm actually writing it. Because I can put down an outline, this, and this happens. And then when I get there, I'm like, that is absolutely not going to work. I can't really visualize it and plan it until I'm seeing it through the character's eyes, basically. I might think I can, but what I put down on paper is just not that great.
So whenever you're going through this process of creating, a series, like you said, this was originally supposed to be a short story. MurderBot decided they weren't having it. This was going to be a bigger narrative overall. Is there a certain point where you had to start looking ahead and being like, because there are elements that are introduced in the first novella that are then further explored in the second. There's clearly a much bigger story rolling out in these? Even if you aren't outlining, how much planning in your head are you doing for where that's going?
Not very much, sadly. I wish I did more. When I did All Systems Red, I thought it was just going to be the one novella because it was obviously needed to be longer than a short story. I did it as a novella, and then Tor.com bought it. Then they asked for a second one. And originally what I started working on was the whole story that goes from All Systems Red to Exit Strategy was going to be an artificial condition. I started kind of working on it on that basis, and then kind of realized that's not going to work. I need more of MurderBot's development. So I got rid of all that, and then brought it back to start right after MurderBot left the station and All Systems Red, and what happened then. And then I think by the time I'd finished Artificial Condition, I'd had they wanted 2 more novellas. Then I knew I had that kind of idea of where I wanted to go with Exit Strategy, and so the other 2 were kind of like getting me there. And Rogue Protocol is kind of, well, I don't want to spoil it, but it kind of positions the story to be able to launch into Exit Strategy.
So yeah, there's definitely some working parts to kind of figure out there. And I do really like you said, I mean, the first novella into the second really pick up, within hours or days of each other. So it was a very easy transition to hop from one to the next. And I feel like there are certain parallels whenever MurderBot is enjoying Sanctuary Moon and talking about it with art and getting the sense that MurderBot's living its own serial. It just kind of hasn't figured that out yet early on in the story, which is a thing I dig a lot. What then, you said you're a discovery writer. What are your tools of the trade? What do you write in?
I just use Word. I do everything in Word and make notes. And I hear people talk about Scrivener and other things like that, but it's just sort of never appealed to me.
It's interesting to me that I would have to go back through all the episodes and kind of tally this to get a real scientific representative idea here. But it strikes me that most of the discovery writers or the pantsers seem to just write in Word or write in maybe or Pages or something like that, something very simplified. And the ones who are outliners and are more structured tend to lean into Scrivener or similar resources where they have a lot more ability to do a whole bunch of things. And it really does seem like those tools tend to lend themselves towards a certain type of thinking process.
Yeah, I really think they do. And I think if I had really elaborate outlines and almost sort of storyboards the way some people do, that would be really helpful. But yeah, as it is, it'd be just like I wouldn't use those features.
Yeah, it really does seem to be the way that I think the more organized a writer wants to make the process, particularly with outlining and tons of research and things like that, the more those tools lend to them. But for a lot of other people, it seems like as much as like Word just straight up horrifies me, there's a freedom in just being able to go to the blank page and just be able to dump stuff in and not have to feel like you're organizing things or having too many tools in your way, I guess.
Yeah, basically, when I start getting organized, it's when I turn the little thing on to have the page numbers.
That counts as some level of organization for sure. So like I said at the top, I mean, they're the 4 novellas that were already available: All Systems Red, Artificial Condition, Rogue Protocol, Exit Strategy. And then the latest novel, the full-length novel, just dropped. We're recording this on May 12th. I think it was May 5th or 6th that it came out.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So it just came available, Network Effect. Of course, this is the time of COVID, and there's still a lot of shelter in place. So I think ebooks are booming. Physical books are languishing a little bit. I would imagine that you had a pretty good ebook following to begin with because of the nature of the books being novella. And glancing at the various online retailers, it looks like the ebooks are relatively inexpensive right now for people if they want to go and snatch up all of them. And I suggest, I recommend and heartily push vehemently that they should go get those right now because I think the series is awesome. And I know it was the dose of exactly what I needed right now. And as soon as this interview gets over and I go to have lunch, I'm going to go right into the 3rd novel. Where should people be following you online so they can keep up with your work and know when new stuff is coming?
I'm on Twitter. I'm Martha Wells 1, the numeral 1. And then I have a blog on, it's marthawells.dreamwith.org. It's DREAM with WIDTH.org. And then I have a website at marthawells.com. It's not that it links to you can find the link for the blog and the Twitter on there. And I think I'm on Goodreads too, but I just kind of list the books that I'm reading on Goodreads. I don't do very much on there. It's mostly the blog and Twitter.
Well, awesome. Like I said, all those books are available now. People should hop out and grab them. I was so excited to get my, because I mean, I've been aware of this series since it came out in 2017. I really struggle because of I'm not the world's fastest reader, and there's a huge to be read shelf sitting off to the side of me that people send me stuff all the time. And so a good portion of the time, I only have a chance to read what I'm reading for this show. And so when this book came out, I was like, finally, this is the excuse. Like, I am going to get these books and I'm going to read them. Cause also, I mean, I would hang up the cover of All Systems Red on my wall as a poster, because it's awesome. And it's, so evocative of what's going on here, but maybe doesn't quite capture the wry, personality that MurderBot has. I don't know there's any way to do that other than just experiencing the character. And, before I oversell it, people should just do that thing. They should just read it.
Well, what they did with the cover is really interesting. Somebody pointed out the actual art is the picture of MurderBot in the armor with the faceplate opaque. So this is what the world sees of MurderBot. And then as soon as you open the cover and you read the first line, that's MurderBot as a person. And it's the contrast that's really cool.
The version that you see on the cover is how MurderBot would prefer to present.
Uh-huh.
They like to be behind the opaque glass. They like to be hidden and not show their face and to pretend to be a person. So I feel like the poster matches what MurderBot would prefer to sell itself as.
Basically, yes.
But again, great combination of great covers, great novels, excellent ongoing series. I'm so excited to continue delving into it. And Martha, thank you so much for joining me on Fictitious.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.
This has been Season 5, Episode 8 of Fictitious. Listen and subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or search for the show using your favorite podcasting app. You can also find a full archive of every episode at fictitiouspodcast.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it on your social profiles, tell all your book-loving friends, or write a review. All of it supports the authors who appear on the program and helps me to grow the podcast. My next interview features Pung Shepard, author of The Book of M. Subscribe now so you don't miss it. I'm Adrian Buskey. Thanks for listening to Fictitious.